Hello, and welcome to Reducing Bias in Screening and Interviewing, a webinar for AmeriCorps leaders in the VISTA program. Though VISTA leaders are not responsible for selecting new members, they can play an important role in the screening and interviewing process. This webinar looks at ways to ensure a more equitable selection process by focusing on ways to reduce unconscious bias during screening and interviewing. I'm your host, Andy King, Senior Training Specialist at AmeriCorps VISTA. Our presenter is Erin Barnhart. Erin is an internationally recognized trainer and educator on domestic and international service, service learning, and volunteer engagement. An adjunct professor at the University of Oregon and a volunteer management consultant, Erin has developed and delivered effective engagement tools, trainings, and resources for volunteers, interns, students, field professionals, and service learning organizations worldwide. A former Fulbright scholar and an AmeriCorps NCCC alum, Dr. Barnhart earned her PhD in urban studies, focusing on international civic engagement and community development. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so glad to have this opportunity today to talk about reducing bias during the selection of new VISTA members. It's such an important process to approach both strategically and inclusively, and I'm excited to talk about how VISTA leaders can implement effective practices for countering unconscious bias during the screening and interviewing processes at their site. So, what are we going to cover today? Let's look at our discussion items for this session. First, we will define unconscious bias and discuss how it can negatively impact the AmeriCorps member selection process. Next, we will identify effective practices to reduce bias in the screening process. And lastly, we'll describe practices and strategies for reducing bias during interviews. So let's begin. I'd like to start by discussing the purpose of screening and interviewing. We might accept that, of course, these are standard parts of any hiring process, but it's important to pause and consider why. Do we screen simply for efficiency, to narrow the pool of potential candidates? Do we interview just to hear responses to carefully chosen questions? I would argue that, yes, while both of those are important, it actually goes beyond that. Screening and interviewing are critical steps for not just finding a person to fill a role, but rather to find the right person. And it's important to note here that there is no such thing as only one right person. Instead, when I say right, I mean finding the best possible match between what the organization and site need, what the VISTA position can offer the candidate, or what the candidate needs, and how the two fit and balance together. Screening and interviewing also provides opportunities to implement a fair and equitable process for determining that fit and balance, one that can ensure that both the application process and the service itself from its very beginnings are inclusive and accessible. This is especially true when seeking to engage and potentially select people for VISTA positions who are applying from the very community being served. Overall, we need to ensure the VISTA service is open to everyone, and designing an accessible selection process is the first step. So to ground our conversation, let's take a quick look at the roles VISTA leaders can play in member selection and compare them to supervisor roles. We'll start by looking at roles in screening. VISTA leaders can conduct an initial screening process to identify if a candidate for a VISTA member position has the minimum qualifications for the role. Then if the candidate appears to be a good applicant to advance in the selection process, they can then recommend potentially prioritizing the candidate for supervisor review and panel interview. There are also a few very important things that VISTA leaders cannot do. These are the responsibilities of the supervisor, like criminal background or other formal screening, and actually choosing which specific candidates to advance. VISTA leaders can make recommendations to their supervisors based on their initial screening of application materials, but ultimately the decision to advance a candidate is that of the supervisor or project director. Now let's repeat that same process with interviewing. Here are the areas where VISTA leaders can drive the process. Leaders can notify candidates who have been selected for interviews. They can coordinate interview logistics, including answering questions about the interview process and ensuring that that process is accessible for all candidates, keeping in mind different levels of access to technology or transportation, as well as potential schedule complications like work or family responsibilities. Leaders can schedule and train the interview panel, making recommendations to the supervisor for who should join this panel in order to ensure a diverse team of interviewers who bring different perspectives and considerations given their personal identities, characteristics, roles within the organization, and levels of responsibility. They can draft questions for the panel to ask each candidate as part of the interview, making them consistent from interview to interview so that the playing field is as level as possible for considering each applicant. And lastly, leaders can participate on the panel with the supervisor's approval and offer input on the applicants. Now for the VISTA supervisor role. While leaders can recommend questions for the panel, the supervisor will determine the final questions that will be asked. Similarly, the hiring decision post-interview will be made by the supervisor, as will notifying applicants about those selection decisions. Leaders should not be sending notice of selection decisions. So now that we've briefly gone over VISTA leader roles in screening and interviewing, let's move on to our next topic, unconscious bias. So let's start our discussion of unconscious bias by defining what it is and discussing some of the forms it can take. Then we will see what we can do to minimize it in order to make the AmeriCorps application and selection process fair and accessible to all and every applicant. We're going to start by defining unconscious bias. You may have heard this term before. It's also sometimes called hidden bias or implicit bias, but what exactly does it mean? So here's a definition from the University of California, San Francisco. Bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. Biases may be held by an individual, group, or institution and can have negative or positive consequences. So what does it mean if it's unconscious or implicit? Let's watch a very short video together here to help illustrate this concept.
Boss is coming.
Can you take care of this for me?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Wait, let me guess. You had a very different mental picture in your head when I said boss. Did it look more like him? Don't worry, you're not alone. Our brains make automatic associations without us even realizing it. And while these associations help us make rapid-fire decisions, they can also be influenced by our potential blind spots. Prototype bias happens when we have a preconceived notion of who we think would be right for a particular role based on stereotypes. These mental pictures are based on who we've seen succeed in the past and can influence who we think will succeed in the future. Let's test the theory. Don't worry, just between us. I'm gonna say a word and I want you to point to the word on the screen that you most associate with it. Ready? Let's go. Delicate, powerful, caring, family, career, strong. What just happened? Well, if you're like most people, you associated communal words with female and assertive words with male, because those implicit associations are ingrained in our unconscious mind. A network of researchers from prominent universities developed the implicit association test. This test helps people identify their potential unconscious biases across a variety of dimensions. These types of ingrained associations can often shape our prototypes for who's qualified to lead in the workplace. Take the orchestra. When orchestras started conducting blind auditions in the 70s, the number of female musicians shot up 20%. So either women suddenly played exponentially better when behind the curtain, or the conductors weren't aware they had a prototype bias towards male musicians, and this bias was costing them talent. Another study found that the exact same resumes with more black-sounding names received 50% fewer callbacks than those same resumes with traditionally white names. The idea of prototype bias cuts even deeper than that. Studies show we often have prototypes for the people we believe would succeed in a job, and we may unconsciously change our criteria to help those people get the job. You may be thinking, I'm not like that. Well, the participants in a study on prototype bias thought the same thing. And ironically, those who thought they were most objective ended up being the most biased. Blind spots can span any dimension of diversity and can potentially lead to bad decisions. Not only can blind spots limit our own choices, they may result in missed opportunities that don't lead to the best possible outcomes. The good news is that there are ways to overcome prototype bias. You can start by setting objective criteria. This can help prevent you from being swayed by irrelevant factors. And you can double-check your objectivity by sharing the why behind your decisions. Lastly, don't make assumptions based solely on your idea of fit, because when it comes to success, one size doesn't fit all.
Okay, so as you just saw in the video, unconscious bias is a prejudice we may feel either for or against a thing, person, or group that we may not even be aware of. However, despite not being aware of it, it can still influence our actions, inform our opinions, and, relevant to this webinar, determine how we conduct selection processes. So let's discuss the latter next, types of unconscious bias that might unwittingly arise during the VISTA selection process. The first is identity bias. We may feel unconsciously more drawn to or more biased against specific candidates based on an aspect of their identity. For example, their race or ethnicity, their gender identity, their age, or their nationality. The second is prototype bias. Like you saw in the film, we may apply a prototype bias for how we consider the candidacy of an applicant, mapping them against our own unconscious image of who we think will be right for the role, based on who we've seen succeed or struggle in the past. A third type is affinity bias. We're often automatically drawn to people similar to ourselves, shared life experiences, similar personality traits, or shared aspects of identity. Without realizing we're doing it, we might favor people who are similar to us while dismissing or devaluing the experiences of someone who is very different. The important thing to remember here is that unconscious bias is everywhere. We all experience this phenomenon, and it can potentially affect every part of our lives. Every interaction with others, every decision we make, including selecting new VISTA members. This means that we are each also responsible for identifying our own unconscious biases and taking steps to neutralize them. So let's talk about ways to recognize and address our own unconscious biases. While these steps can be used in every part of our lives, we're going to use them today as a specific lens for discussing strategies for screening and interviewing VISTA applicants. First, we need to develop personal awareness of our own unconscious biases. How do they work? How do they influence my perceptions and decision-making? Next, we need to directly challenge stereotypes and other skewed perceptions. And then lastly, to bring it all together, we need to specifically assess which biases might emerge during our screening and interviewing processes, and then practice countering them. Okay, so let's start with developing personal awareness. The good news is that you're already doing that right now as part of this webinar. Becoming more conscious of our potential biases is a critical first step in this process. You might be able to identify some of the unconscious biases that are present for you, say certain types of people or cultural practices that you react to more favorably or negatively. It's also quite possible, though, that you don't know where your biases might lie. After all, they are unconscious by nature. For that reason, you might consider completing an assessment to suss out some of those details. For example, Project Implicit at Harvard University. We've included a link to that site and other resources in the handout. You can also seek out discussion or brown bag groups with others, in person or online, who are exploring their own biases through conversation and reflection with peers.
All right, thanks for all that, Erin. All right, so now we'd like to hear from you, our participants, in this chat activity. And the question is, What is one way a VISTA leader could become aware of their own unconscious biases? Erin mentioned the implicit association test that Harvard created. Are there other tools like that that you're aware of, or maybe other techniques or practices that you could use for developing your own self-awareness about your own potential biases? So we'll use the chat for this activity. Please select everyone so that your peers can see your responses. And we will take a look when they come in and read out a few of your ideas. So again, what is at least one way that a VISTA leader, or anyone really, could become aware of their own unconscious biases? All right, so we've got responses coming in. Anita says the way they act toward a person and their particular attitude. Let's see, Janelle mentioned by gauging their thoughts about certain people or groups of people. Sonia again mentioned attitude. Yeah, so I see this common theme here around looking at your own thoughts towards particular people or groups and your attitudes there. Sarah mentions reflecting on the cultural diversity of where you're from, right? So doing your own sort of self-reflection. Becca mentions the implicit association test. It's fantastic. I think being open to meeting people who are not like you is another technique. You may find you have assumptions about folks that you didn't realize. Absolutely. And Iris mentions looking for patterns, right? So great suggestions here. Elizabeth says reflecting on why I'm fighting for, or maybe not for, a particular candidate. Self-reflection, again, understanding my own affinity groups, and having discussions with your supervisor or other community members, right? So some great ideas here, some themes coming out about self-reflection, and then some tools that you could use looking for patterns and attitudes. Great. So thanks for those. If you have others, keep them coming. But we wanted to at least get this started. Erin, what did you notice about these ideas that we've seen so far?
Yeah, I'm seeing sort of three categories here, which is reflection, observation, and discussion. And I think those are right on. There's reflection for yourself to think about how you interact and what you react to. Observation, observing yourself as well as observing others. And then of course, discussion with others to learn their observations. And the point I would make about those, the nice thing is that there's a pretty low bar for the first two for you to get started. Self-reflection and observation start with yourself. So that's a good place to start with something that can sometimes be uncomfortable. And then the discussion can be a piece that you work your way up to. But all three of those are really terrific categories for raising this personal awareness. All right, so let's continue on. We're going to move on now to challenging stereotypes. So your next step in this process is to recognize and address unconscious biases by gathering new perspective and challenging those stereotypes. So one strategy is to start by putting yourself in another person's shoes. Imagine what might it be like for someone to be a candidate in your selection process. Given the potential unconscious biases you've identified, what might they feel or experience? Another method to carefully and respectfully gain more perspective is through experience and interaction. For example, if you were seeking to specifically neutralize a bias that you've identified or recognized that you feel against unhoused individuals, you might seek to volunteer at a shelter or a meal distribution site in order to better understand people's lived experiences and to challenge your preconceived attitudes. The key words again here, though, are carefully and respectfully. In our quest to learn and counter our biases, we must always be careful to not further stereotype people by too readily lumping them into large buckets with one shared characteristic. And importantly, our desire to learn more about ourselves must never come at the expense of disrespecting another person's autonomy or humanity. You can also try countering these perceptions by visualizing counter stereotypes. One way you can do this is to picture someone in your life whom you like or love, a family member or a friend. Think about this person and then map their characteristics or traits onto a potential VISTA member candidate. Would you feel any differently about the candidate if they were more similar to a loved one? You can also try identifying the characteristics a candidate has that they share with someone you respect, someone in your life, or even a public figure, and then assess if your perspective or attitude towards them might change once you affiliate them with this person that you admire. The goal here is to shift your perceptions of the person to neutralize any unconscious bias. So now that you've spent some time developing personal awareness and challenging stereotypes, you're ready to commit to countering specific biases in the member selection process. Start by once again considering your own potential unconscious biases and then assessing where you think you might experience them based on the positions you're trying to fill. What kind of skills and traits are needed for this position? How might you react to people with variations of those traits? How might identity bias, prototype bias, or affinity bias apply to these potential candidates? Then practice neutralizing these potential biases proactively as practice and in the moment, using some of the practices we've just discussed, like gathering perspective and countering possible stereotypes. Working to understand our unconscious biases is essential, but it's not enough. Since many biases are unconscious, it can be hard to know whether we have successfully overcome them. Also, when working with others, it's difficult to know how aware they are of their own biases. This is why it's important to also develop and sustain organizational commitments to countering unconscious bias through practices that reduce the impact of bias on decision-making. You'll find many terrific resources online for establishing organizational practices around minimizing and neutralizing unconscious bias during hiring and selection processes, including one that we're going to share in the resources section at the end. Okay, so now let's get into the specifics of screening and interviewing. Again, seeking to identify and neutralize unconscious biases as we go. Let's start with 4 typical practices for screening VISTA applicants, and then look for ways to reduce bias in each. First, assess their application materials for relevant skills and experiences. Then consider their professional work history broadly, both paid and volunteer. Next, take some time to explore their motivations. And lastly, pay close attention to details. First, we're going to assess relevant skills and experiences. Now, this is a pretty typical part of evaluating any new applicant. What are they good at? What are their strengths? What have they done before that is applicable to this position? Start by reading their full application from start to finish to try to get a complete picture of the candidate as a whole person who brings unique experiences and perspectives to the selection process. Then go back and identify specific skills and experiences. Look first for hard skills. Those are those applicable, practicable skills that are often specific to a role, like computer software competency, grant writing, or program development. But be sure to also look for more transferable, or what sometimes are called soft skills: communications, experience working with diverse populations, and ability to change course quickly and creatively. Then, to reduce unconscious bias when screening applications, set your expectations from the start by considering that many VISTA applicants are early in their careers, so their skill set and experience might be limited. Don't rule them out for this reason alone, though. Instead, consider which skills are required, abilities that are time-dependent to learn or would be difficult to learn on site, like second language fluency or a specific trade, versus skills that they can potentially learn during their service with appropriate training and mentorship. If there are required qualifications, then all candidates must have them to proceed in the selection process. However, if there isn't anything in that bucket, then consider everyone's potential ability to learn and do the work, regardless of how closely specific past experience aligns with the member position or how impressive or limited the resume might be. Another practice for reducing bias is to have someone else download the applications and then redact the applicant name and other identifiers that could potentially lead to bias. Similar to the blind audition practice conducted, pun intended, by the orchestra in the video, level the playing field by removing identifying elements that could trigger unconscious bias. As part of reviewing their skills and experiences, you'll also do an assessment of what they specifically list as their work and volunteer history. What roles and responsibilities have they held? What kinds of work have they done, paid or unpaid? And how might that be an asset for serving as a VISTA member? As you do this, consider unpaid experience on par with their paid professional experience. This can include activities like volunteering, involvement in extracurricular activities or service clubs, as well as family responsibilities like elder care or child care. It doesn't take a paycheck to make the experience valuable. When reviewing their work in volunteer history, focus more on the responsibilities and the results of their work rather than the position title. How might their specific tasks and responsibilities be applicable to the VISTA member position for which your site is hiring? Unlike in screening for ongoing typical work positions, gaps in work history here may not be as relevant. Again, keep in mind that many VISTA applicants may have significant gaps due to school, family or elder care, or other interruptions. However, this doesn't mean that they aren't a strong candidate for this role. On that same track, spend a little time scanning their application for other evidence of balancing personal and professional tasks. For example, did they balance part-time work and school at the same time? Have they been involved in the PTA or held leadership positions with community organizations? Balancing personal and professional tasks and responsibilities is an invaluable skill unto itself. Next up, take a look at the way they've expressed their interest in and motivation for the VISTA position, rather than only reviewing the specific experiences, skills, and history that they've shared. Review their motivational statement in the AmeriCorps application and their response to why I volunteer in the community service section. What can you learn about their goals and interests from these responses? Does it seem like their personal and professional goals and motivations might align with what you can offer at your site? Now, it's important to note here that we're not reviewing their motivations to apply value to their answers, but rather just to ensure that they align with what we can offer in the role. I want to learn new skills, or I need a new path forward in my life, are just as valid of motivations as I'm excited to serve in AmeriCorps, or I'm passionate about the issue this position will address. Instead, look at their motivations to assess if this position aligns with the specifics of their goals. For example, if they say they are excited to work independently, but your site is very team-oriented, that might not be a good alignment. However, if they are motivated to learn more about building program materials, and that's something this position will do, that could be a great fit. Ask yourself if you're responding positively to a candidate because their motivations are similar to your own, or if you might not feel drawn to a candidate because the tone they used is much different than what you would use. View the person's interests and motivations not through a lens of how similar are they to me, but rather, how well might they perform in this role, given what I'm learning about them here? Similarly, keep an eye on likability. If you find yourself liking an applicant or not liking another, consider why. Is it because you share interests, because they sound fun, or like someone you'd want to get to know? While these are admittedly good ways to potentially find a friend, they can serve as unconscious biases to eliminate otherwise qualified people from a professional opportunity like VISTA. One last thing I want to mention here is part of your screening process is to pay close attention to the details of their application. This can be the mechanics of their writing, like punctuation, grammar, and flow, especially if this position requires strong writing skills or will create public-facing written content. Also, look for where they may have left things incomplete or filled out things incorrectly. Did they finish everything that was required of them while applying? Applications are a moment when people often put their best foot forward. If there are mistakes at this stage, consider whether this might be an issue, given the requirements and responsibilities of the role. But then after you've considered all of this, check your biases again, starting with asking whether a mistake or omission is really that important. Is it really a deal breaker if they had a spelling error or if the punctuation is wrong? Similarly, consider the relevance of the mistake to the VISTA role. For example, does it matter if they aren't a strong writer if they'll spend most of their position communicating by phone or in person? Lastly, give people the benefit of the doubt, rather than assume a mistake means sloppiness or lack of attention to detail. There could be many good reasons for mistakes. Applicants will have different levels of and aptitudes in schooling, different skills that may or may not apply to this position, or maybe completing this application in a second or third language. Some may have completed it at home in a quiet room with a computer of their own, while others may have filled it out in a school computer lab full of distractions.
All right, so it's time for us to hear from you again. This time we'd like you to share in the chat an example of a screening practice that you've seen in action, one that you think could help neutralize bias. So this could be something you've done yourself or something you've seen used at your sites, or maybe it's just something that you've read about or heard about in practice elsewhere. And again, be sure you're sending your response to everyone. So again, what are some examples of a screening practice that you think could help reduce or neutralize bias? All right, so we've got a few in here. Having a group of employees or managers review a resume or a CV, screening everyone regardless of their application, having a diverse group of interviewers, right? So these are all great examples here. Abstaining from viewing names and genders, only reviewing the application content. Great examples. And we'll probably get a few more coming in, but oh yeah, here we go. So doing phone calls instead of video to help reduce bias. Again, screening everyone, diverse group. Yep, that audio only is showing up a couple of times. Great. So Erin, what has stood out here for you?
So I'm excited to see immediately applicable options here, things that people are already doing, and that for others on the call, if you haven't done this already, you can see that peers are using it successfully at their site. I'm also seeing some great previews into our next section when we talk about interviews, because some of the things folks have mentioned here are things I'm going to mention too. So if I repeat them, I promise I didn't miss that you said it, but I'm going to repeat what you said because there's some really great strategies in here for interviews too. All right, so thinking of, or rather speaking of interviewing, let's go ahead and move on to that next step. So effective practices for interviewing. Specifically, what we're going to talk about here is strategies for engaging a panel that is mindful of unconscious bias and committed to an inclusive process, ideas for structuring an interview process that is accessible and equitable, and how to structure interview questions to learn more about a candidate's hard and soft skills, as well as to assess fit and explore goals. Okay, so we're going to start with convening what we want to be, which is an inclusive, accessible interview environment. So we're going to consider integrating several things into our interview panel in order to achieve this. First, seek to convene a panel that is committed to accessible, inclusive interviews, one that is diverse and ideally representative of the community you serve, including race, gender, age, etc. Be sure to also include diversity of experience at your site, responsibility within your organization, and familiarity with VISTA members. Once you have a panel identified and have confirmed their availability, offer tools and tips for them to explore their own unconscious biases and how bias could unintentionally inform their judgment. Make these brief and easy to access to improve the odds they'll be used. For example, you might share short videos like the one we showed here, online articles, or even put together a one-page tip sheet using some of the advice and ideas from today's presentation. Another part of training the panel will be going over your assessment systems. Structure interviews as panel conversations where each person is assigned questions to ask, evenly balanced among panel participants. Use score sheets with a multitude of criteria on which they should assess each candidate. Make sure the criteria is objective and uniform for each candidate. And offer numeric scales so that individual panel impressions and responses aren't binary, yes or no, but rather offer some space for nuance, like a scale from 1 to 10. Panelists should rate candidates individually first, and then using their own score, rather doing that first, using their own score sheets and tallying their overall ratings, and then convene as a group to discuss their individual scores, impressions, and questions. This will help to minimize the influence of some panelist opinions over others. When you're discussing your score sheets, ask each panelist to practice one of the things you saw in the short video earlier. Share the why behind your decisions in order to help clarify and check for unbiased responses. And then one last thing, be aware of the possibility for unconscious bias to arise during these group discussions. Some panelists may make assumptions or allow unconscious bias to inform how they view the ratings and opinions of other panelists. Some may disagree with the scores of others. It's important to emphasize here that everyone's experiences, opinions, and reactions are valid, and that the purpose of the group discussion is to share each person's recommendations and then discuss them using a consensus model. Multiple applicants may be strong candidates, and it isn't about choosing the only one right one. Rather, it's about coming to consensus as an informed, diverse group on who among many candidates should potentially be offered the role. Okay, so now we're thinking about interview structure. There are a few categories of structure to consider here. First, there are the time and location elements. Try to offer a range of days and times for potential interviews, recognizing that applicants may have school, jobs, or family responsibilities to navigate. For location, offer a phone-only interview for your first contact in order to remove visual biases. Phones are also often one of the most accessible methods for people to participate, as many people have more access to a phone than they do a laptop, reliable Wi-Fi access, or transportation. Next, ask the same questions of every candidate in the same order every time. Anticipate what kinds of follow-up questions might be necessary and build them into the script so that every candidate has the same uniform opportunity to answer questions and share their stories from the same equitable prompts. Also, limit small talk between questions. An interview is not the place to build rapport, but rather to assess someone's abilities for and alignment with the role. So of course, be friendly and welcoming, but don't deviate from the script. Limiting small talk and asking the same predetermined questions of each candidate will help to even the playing field. And it can also help the panel steer clear of topics that are not okay for employers to discuss with applicants, things like marital status, family structure, religion, or country of origin. Structure your questions so that they make the ask in a few different ways to help the applicant best understand what you're hoping to learn. Use several terms or define them within the question so that people can grasp what you mean. You might ask someone about their experiences with conflict resolution and they won't know how to answer. But if you ask them to share an example of a time when they needed to help calm down others or diffuse a tense situation, they may have great examples to share. Also, ask for real-world examples. Many times interviews focus on hypothetical situations or ask big, broad, sweeping questions. And for many folks, hypotheticals are difficult to grasp. And for early career folks, they may not have experience answering the kinds of generalist interview questions that many of us later in our careers now expect. Instead, ask them to share real-world examples from their lives and frame these questions as a request. Please tell us about a time, rather than an open-ended question like, what are your experiences with? Or a hypothetical situation like, what would you do if? You can even offer prompts for the kinds of experiences that might fit the bill. For example, please tell us about a time when you were responsible for leading a project from start to finish. This can be something you did in a past job, or maybe even while you were in school. An important note here, while candidates can voluntarily offer examples and stories from their personal lives, including sharing details about their family structure, marital status, faith practices, etc., the panel cannot explicitly ask questions about this kind of protected information. Limit your questions to asking for examples from professional realms, again, both paid and unpaid, like work, school, and service, and avoid questions specifically about the personal lives or families of candidates. Finally, interviewing is a two-way assessment, and you can help applicants decide if the position is a good fit for them by sharing details about the role. What is it like to serve there? What's the team like? What work environment can they expect? So that they can self-determine whether they might thrive there. Also, be sure to offer them space to ask you questions. Answer honestly in a friendly manner, but again, keep it formal and focused. Okay, so interview questions. When determining which interview questions to ask candidates for a VISTA member position, I recommend that you consider several different categories of inquiry. The goal here is to learn as much as you can about a candidate by exploring their skills, perspectives, goals, and potential team and organizational fit through a number of lenses. Start by asking the candidate questions to learn more about hard skills that are central to this specific VISTA member role. Ask them to share real-world examples of when and how they utilize them. Encourage them to reflect on whether they have ever used these kinds of skills in other parts of their life. For example, maybe they've never done writing as part of a paid position, but maybe they did a lot of writing in school or as a volunteer. Next, ask questions about soft skills, again, focusing primarily on those that are most relevant to this position, like collaboration, communicating effectively, critical thinking, or conflict resolution. You can also ask questions about soft skill-related traits that are valuable to VISTA service, like adaptability and flexibility, problem solving, resourcefulness, and creativity. Another category of inquiry that you'll want to carefully explore is whether they might be a good fit for your organization and you a good fit for them. For example, if you're a fast-moving site where people need to make quick decisions, should you be looking for someone who can keep up? Or might it be more about personal and professional style? You're looking for someone who is driven and creative rather than someone more laid back and steady. Another fit and style lens to explore through questions for the candidate is whether they will thrive in the position given how it is structured. If they like working with others, will they do okay in a position that's designed to work independently? Also consider team fit. Now this one is tricky because you don't necessarily want to find someone who is a carbon copy of the people already on your team. Yes, this often makes for a smoother team experience, but it also means you may end up with similar types of people who share the same types of experiences and backgrounds, potentially omitting important perspectives and representation from your team. Last but not least, ask questions that encourage them to share and consider their own professional goals and objectives. People appropriately matched to professional opportunities are more likely to thrive, stay, and do excellent work. Assess fit from their perspective as well, learning more about their goals and objectives for serving in VISTA in the process. Some long-term questions you might ask are, what might they like to do next in their career? Where do they hope to end up? How might this position help them make progress towards these professional goals? You can also ask about shorter-term goals, like what are they looking to gain from VISTA member service? And what skills do they want to acquire in this role? What do they want to learn and experience in this position? And how might these skills relate to their own long-term professional goals, or how might they seek to apply them in the future? Okay, so questions are the core of what we do in interviews, but they also create ample opportunities for unconscious bias to inform our opinions. So here's some quick strategies to recognize, prevent, and or neutralize these biases through our interview questions. Before the interview even begins, review your questions for possible bias. How might someone acquire necessary hard skills through something other than formal education or employment? How might you ask a question about skills framed in a way to help them self-identify their abilities? How might you seek to avoid industry or field-specific terms that someone new to this work might not know? Here's an example of how you can potentially use more accessible language. Rather than ask, please share an example of your experiences with project management, you might instead ask, please share an example of a time when you designed and led something from idea to conclusion. Also, remind the committee of the difference between required skills and preferred or bonus skills. What must the right candidate absolutely have to start this position tomorrow versus what can they learn on site with appropriate training and mentorship? One way to clarify this for the committee in advance is to have a list of the skills needed for this position on hand, where you have identified which ones are required and which can be learned on site. Also, challenge your own definition of fit. What it means to you may not be what it means to others on the panel. Discuss this with them in advance to identify how each of you might define this metric, and then make it a goal to not undervalue or dismiss differences of opinion or value. And then also be conscious of and try not to judge candidate answers if they don't align perfectly with your expectations. Honest answers are best, and it's part of checking our biases and striving for good fit, not perfect fit, to not expect fully fleshed out answers from people who might be still learning how to talk about their own skills and experiences. So there's a lot of questions that should not be asked during an interview. Of course, you need to avoid asking questions that are illegal, things that could get at age, race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, marital status, parental status, and others. However, beyond illegal questions, there are also those that can introduce bias into the interview. So I want to talk about briefly 3 types in particular. First are questions unrelated to the duties of the position. This type of question can appear to be job related, but in reality, it doesn't really help you assess whether someone can effectively carry out the duties. An example here might be, tell me about your dream job. Another is questions that can carry a cultural bias that may not be immediately apparent. A common example are questions that are biased against applicants from cultures who may find it difficult to sell themselves because this may feel like bragging. An example here might be, why do you feel you are the best candidate for the position? And then a third type of question that can introduce bias is those that ask about personal fit. Such questions may exclude people from diverse communities, backgrounds, and identities. An example there might be, what type of people do you like to work with? Again, be sure your questions will give you information about how well the applicant can meet the requirements of the position.
All right, so again, we'd like to hear from you this one more time. This chat question is, imagine that you're seeking a new VISTA member with strong writing skills. How might you ask a candidate about their writing ability, but do it in an equitable way? So again, how might you ask a candidate about their writing ability and do it in an equitable way? So we'll use the chat. Be sure to send your response to everyone, and I'll give you just a moment to collect your thoughts. All right, well, that didn't take long already. Sonia and Judy have this idea asking for a writing sample. Yeah, Janelle's the same thing. Rebecca, that's coming up a lot. Let's see. Janelle goes on to say, I would not ask about GPA or previous grades, etc. Yeah, but it seems like writing sample is a solid idea there. What other possibilities are there? Let's see. In the interview, you can ask how you've utilized your writing skills, asking for past experience with different types of writing. Great. Anna says, give them a case study. All right, so we got a number of different examples there. Keep those coming if you have ideas and are typing them out. Here, Laura has a sort of a variation. Ask what topic they love to write about, and then tie that into the new writing sample. All right, so we've seen a few different approaches here. Erin, any thoughts on what's been shared?
Yeah, just really terrific suggestions. And one of the things I like about specifically the writing sample that has come up so frequently is that gives them some time and space to do it in advance, as opposed to doing it in the moment where there may be that pressure of the interview, the pressure of wherever they're able to take the call. Giving people some flexibility to determine where and how and when they write, as well as where they've done their best work and then choose to share that with you, is a great way to meet people where they are.
All right, thank you for participating in that chat. I've got one more question for you. This one is a multiple choice, and it's our usual opportunity for you to see how well you've been following along with the presentation. You'll see this question pop up in a pop-up window on your screen for a poll. And the question is, which of the following is a practice to reduce unconscious bias during interviews? Is it begin the interview with friendly chat to put the interviewee at ease? Rate interviewees on your own before discussing with other panelists? Conduct interviews one-on-one to make them less intimidating? Or is it demonstrate commitment to work-life balance by asking about their family? So again, in the pop-up window, make your selection and then click the submit button. Looks like we've got a little more than a third of you have responded, so I'll give you a few more seconds to consider the options there and make your selection. And looks like we're about 2/3 of the way. I'll give you, let's say, 10 or 12 more seconds to get your answer in, and then we'll reveal the correct one. And I have to say there's a little bit more of a spread on this question than on some. I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right, so let's go ahead and close the poll and we'll reveal the answers. You can see how you did. So the correct answer was B, to rate interviewees on your own before discussing them with other panelists. And as you'll recall, that was so that you don't let the responses of other panelists influence you or sort of overwhelm your answer. So more than half of you got that right, about 55%. So good job for those of you who got that correct. Okay, let's turn back to Erin. She's going to share some resources for further exploration.
Thank you so much, Andy. So before we go, I want to point out a few resources that you might find valuable. You can download these from the link that's pasted in the chat. One that I mentioned earlier is Project Implicit at Harvard University. You can access their tools to assess your own implicit or unconscious biases. That's the first step we discussed today towards recognizing and countering them. There's also an interesting Scientific American article about implicit bias that I've added here, and it even discusses some of the benefits and flaws of that Project Implicit assessment tool. And the third one here, this article, Tips for Rooting Out Hidden Bias, is from the Society for Human Resource Management, and it uses the specific lens of what hiring managers are doing to recognize and neutralize hidden bias during their hiring and ongoing HR practices. Lastly, there are many, many resources online that offer strategies for how to counter unconscious biases, how to construct effective hiring processes that are fair and inclusive, and how to structure interview questions to get to the heart of what you hope to learn about a candidate. One that I found to be especially accessible is the University of Washington's DEI HR site, including their page on bias and hiring.
All right, thank you, Erin, for those resources as well as for this really informative presentation. So now we'd like to know what you think of this presentation. So I invite you to complete a short evaluation of the webinar. Your feedback will be important for Erin, and it's also helpful for me as I'm always looking for ways to make these sessions the most useful they can be for you and other VISTA leaders. The survey is probably already open in your browser window behind Zoom, but if not, we've pasted the link there in the chat. Now it's time to see what questions you might have for Erin about our topic today. So we would like to hear about any questions that have come up during the presentation. And for the Q&A, we'll be using the chat. It's just easier to put it all right there. Again, if you don't see the chat panel, you can open that by moving to the bottom of the screen and clicking on that little speech bubble icon. We have our first question. It says, I have a question about the bit of bias with supervisors at a couple of my sites. Of my 7 sites, 2 have now decided they only want to interview applicants from or who are currently living in their site's city. How do I approach this? So Erin, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for sharing it, Tammy. I think I would start with what we saw in the video, which is sharing the why. And so I would ask them the why. What is it specifically about having an applicant live in their site that is important to them? Is it because they feel like, well, they won't understand how we do things unless they live here? Is it that they think it's easier to find someone who's local? Is it specific about transportation or having someone physically in the office? I would want to encourage them to think through what is it that is informing that opinion, and challenge it a little bit with them. So if they say, oh, well, no, I really need someone who understands how we work, you can say, well, is this a required skill? Is it something that someone has to start day one with understanding what it's like to live here? Or is it something they can learn with us on site through training and mentorship and just by being in our community? And helping to challenge that gently in a way that helps them understand that by only having people from our local site, are we also missing perspectives or ideas or opinions from people who may be new and may see things differently than we've always seen them? So I would start with asking them the why, what specifically informs their desire to have people who already live in the site city. Then do a little light, gentle challenging of that why. Is that really required? Why do you think that might be necessary? If they say, oh, they have to have them in the office. Do we have to have them in the office? If someone were to move here, would that not fix that issue? And then offer some suggestions on how they can potentially challenge that.
Great, thanks for that response, Erin. Next, Selena has a question. It's actually 2 parts. I think I'll take the first and then turn to you for ideas around the second. So she asks, are site supervisors participating in webinars like this as well? And wouldn't it be difficult to try to practice these recommendations if the site doesn't participate? So the first part is, yeah, we do have some supervisors who attend these webinars. And even afterwards, of course, they're available on the VISTA campus for anybody to attend. Likewise, we are working to introduce these topics across all of our webinars. So hopefully before long, we'll have one specifically geared to supervisors. But if you feel that there are folks within your organization who would benefit from it, you might recommend they take part in the, or take advantage of the recording. So Erin, do you have any thoughts about how to implement some of these practices, even if, say, the site supervisor hasn't seen this webinar?
Yeah, two quick ideas. One is similar to what we talked about earlier with the interview panel. Share some easily accessible bite-sized resources to help them see the benefits of approaching everything with an awareness of and neutralizing that unconscious bias. It can be that short video. It can be some of the tips from this webinar. It can even be the slides. But helping them understand how it can impact and harm your organization and the goals of your organization if you don't approach it with that mindfulness. And then I think one thing that's worked really well with supervisors and decision makers is share examples with them of how this has been done at other places and how it's been done well and how it results in a stronger base of employees and VISTA members and communities served. So if you can show them real world examples from peer organizations, sometimes that goes even further than just suggesting it as ideas or tips. So the internet, is a big and broad place, and there are lots of great examples out there. You might start with that Society for Human Resource Management article. I do believe it had some concrete examples in there that you might be able to share.
Great. Thank you for all those recommendations, Erin. And thank you, everyone, for participating and for the questions. Before we let you go, I do want to invite you to our next webinar, and that is going to be next month on Thursday, July 14th. We'll look at onboarding practices that can empower your members. So we hope to see you there. I want to again thank Dr. Erin Barnhart of Effective Altruism for her really informative presentation today. And thanks to Bethany DeSoblin for instructional design support and our production team of Colby Wilson and Steve Gray at LSI. Thank you all for joining and participating. We hope to see you again soon.